Pressure grows on Venezuela's president. The US announces more sanctions to force Nicolas Maduro from office. But he is standing firm, refusing to let aid in and closing borders. Russia is warning against US military intervention. So what happens next? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. We'll stand by you until liberty is restored. That's the message from the US Vice President of Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaidó. They met in Colombia as regional countries try to find a way to get President Nicolas Maduro to step down. But he's refusing to go and accuses the US of wanting to start a war in South America. The UN Security Council, meanwhile, is holding another emergency session to discuss the month-long crisis. Alessandro Rampietti reports from Bogotá.
Supporters of Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaidó have waited for this moment, the chance to see him side by side with the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence. The setting, the meeting of the Lima Group in Bogotá, a bloc of mostly Latin American countries supporting Guaidó's claim that he's the legitimate interim president of Venezuela. In a speech, Pence announced new sanctions against Venezuelan officials and called on the bloc to freeze assets controlled by President Nicolas Maduro in their countries, but stopped short of calling for the use of force to house the man he says represents a threat to the hemisphere.
What we've seen in the last 2 days wasn't a bold stroke by a triumphant leader. It was the desperate act of a tyrant clinging to power with violence and intimidation. Since day one of this administration, I'm pleased to report that the United States has recognized the threat that Nicolas Maduro posed to the Venezuelan people and to nations across the region, including ours.
The world's media recorded how Maduro's forces acted to stop the delivery of US aid from Colombia and Brazil. Leaders here announced they will ask the International Criminal Court to treat Maduro's blockade as a crime against humanity. Opposition leader Guaidó said international pressure needs to continue until Maduro is forced out.
El pueblo de Venezuela ha resistido.
The people of Venezuela have resisted, have survived, and today in Bogotá, in this historic meeting, we ask for your help and cooperation to advance the necessary pressure that the regime believes it is resisting. But resistance to what? To democracy?
Outside the meeting, Venezuelans who fled their country's economic crisis gathered to show their support for Guaidó, but claimed only an external military intervention could bring change, something the countries gathered here firmly reject.
It's an error. We're tired of protest, sanctions, proclamations. They're not helpful. Since the sanctions, how many malnourished kids have been saved? How many people with cancer helped? None. That's why an intervention is needed.
In a nutshell, Monday's announcement could be summarized as more of the same. Juan Guaidó said he will try to go back to Venezuela this week and also continue in his efforts to move the aid inside his country. But many, even among supporters of the opposition, fear that more of the same will not change the current stalemate. Alessandro Rampietti, Al Jazeera, Bogotá.
Well, Venezuela's political crisis came to a head in the past month when President Maduro was sworn in for a second term. He was re-elected last May, but the poll was boycotted by the opposition and there were allegations of vote rigging. 2 weeks after Maduro's swearing in, opposition leader Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president. He was backed by the United States, several European countries, and many of Venezuela's neighbours. Maduro responded by severing ties with the US. The standoff between the two men escalated last week over humanitarian aid. Maduro blocked food and medical supplies donated by the US from entering the country. The opposition defied Maduro and tried to get the aid in. Security forces used tear gas and rubber bullets on volunteers. At least 4 people were killed. Well, let's bring in our discussion panel now. In Merida, in Venezuela, via Skype, we've got Paul Dobson, a political analyst in Venezuela. In Washington, D.C., Vanessa Neumann, Latin America analyst at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And in Salford, in Manchester, in the UK, is Colin Harding, he's director of Latin Form. A very warm welcome to all of you. Paul, what did you make of this Lima Group meeting and seeing Juan Guaidó standing next to the Vice President of the United States?
Well, I think this came as no surprise, essentially. We've always known that Juan Guaidó is essentially Washington's man here in Venezuela. He has received the backing of Donald Trump and his government since day one. And to see him in Bogota amongst his allies, obviously, it comes as no surprise. The announcements made in Bogota were a little bit more surprising, however. The United States announced some very light sanctions, we can say, much less than we expected them to announce. Really no sort of measures that will have any impact on the country at all. And the Lima Group itself issued a public statement in which they surprisingly rule out any support for any military intervention into Venezuela, essentially taking it off the table. So this obviously brings a great sigh of relief to Venezuela and all of those who were afraid that the United States were about to launch some sort of military attack on the country.
And yet, Paul, we have President Maduro insisting that the US is still preparing for a military intervention and indeed Russia backing up that claim.
Well, indeed, until Washington actually takes this off the table and makes a public statement, Juan Guaidó also, both Trump and Guaidó have refused to rule this out many times. Everyone else, including the European Union, Spain, Brazil, have all ruled it out except them. So obviously it remains on the table for them until they declare otherwise.
Vanessa, would you agree with that? Was this a rather weak outcome from the Lima Group meeting? Was Juan Guaidó expecting more?
Yes, I think he probably was expecting a bit more. However, you know, these processes are diplomatic, they're slow. Don't forget that now with the Lima Group, we have Mexico that has gone back to its old doctrine of non-interference, and that has really softened a lot of the angle of the Lima Group. Also, I think that there's some concern that the U.S. And the Lima Group don't want to be seen as aggressors. I think what you're going to see, however, is a shift in diplomatic strategy, because the blockage of food, there's some question whether it triggers Article 7, Section 2B of the Rome Convention, which is basically about the mass starvation of people by denying them access to food, which would trigger something like the responsibility to protect, which, as we know, is almost defunct in the last 20 years. But this might be a situation where that might be triggered and might be appropriate. So that's something that I would expect we'll see at the Security Council meeting later today. And that would lead to a stronger action perhaps down the line, but more multilateral.
OK. And Colin, as well, the Lima Group is set to ask the International Criminal Court to treat Maduro's aid blockade as a crime against humanity. Is that something that they might consider, and what would be the impact?
Well, they may indeed. I mean, I think there is certainly a shift in the emphasis of the campaign by the Lima Group and by outside countries supporting Juan Guaidó. I think the President Maduro certainly feels he's got the momentum now, that the wind has been taken out of the opposition's sails. And I think the opposition have tended to underestimate his determination to hang on to power come what may. Right from the very beginning. I think the plan A was that the military would go over to the opposition right away. Plan B was that the humanitarian aid would force the military's hand, and that would lead to a determination. And there doesn't really appear to be a plan C, except Guaidó really having to accept the view expressed by the Lima Group that tightening the diplomatic and political cordon against Venezuela is the way forward. And I think the United States, for the present anyway, accepts that this is the thing to do.
And this UN Security Council meeting that is due later on Tuesday, I mean, Maduro, let's be honest, doesn't really have much to fear from that, does it? Because he has the backing of Russia and he has the backing of China, both of whom could veto anything that comes out of that.
Well, yes, I think that's right. Yes, I think they are going to stick with him, particularly Russia, who have a lot to lose if Maduro goes. But I think really the international community in general is casting around for the best way to proceed. And as we know, the United States has introduced more sanctions against 4 named state governors, for instance, and Mike Pence, the vice president, has called upon Lima Group countries to introduce similar sanctions against Venezuela and against the state oil company PDVSA, and also to deny visas to leading members of the regime. So I think that is where they are at the moment.
Paul, how much of all of this upsets Maduro? Because we've got these sanctions, which I think we all sort of agree were much less than we thought. They were against 4 Maduro allies. But we have got this urging of regional countries from the US to freeze oil assets. And that could really place quite a stranglehold on the Maduro government and what remains of its finances. How concerned is it that it's going to be got that way?
Well, it's worth pointing out that the Maduro government have been trying to deal with US-led sanctions for over 2 years now in a range of capacities. The ones announced yesterday I don't think will worry him at all. The most worrying sanction currently levied by the United States against Caracas is the oil embargo, which was announced nearly a month ago. This will have a massive impact on Venezuela. According to John Bolton's figures, this is going to cost the Venezuelan economy $30 million a day, which is a huge amount of money for any economy, and especially for an economy which is delved into the depth of a recession. However, the Maduro government over the last 2 years has had some success in looking to other global partners in a way to avoid these sanctions. One recent example of this is a list of medicines, high-range medicines, which he submitted to the European Union and basically asked for their help in buying them as a way of getting around these sanctions. Now, this is both a way to undo the discourse of the humanitarian aid bloc. We're seeing the government very open to international humanitarian aid, obviously without any political conditions, but also a way of getting around these financial sanctions, which Washington is imposing on them.
But he's not really facing up to reality, is he? Because, we've got him saying in interviews that Venezuela enjoys a free press and there's freedom of political expression. But then during a couple of interviews that he's given in the last couple of hours, last 24 hours, he's detained one international crew because he didn't like their questions. He's accused another of, quote, lying like Trump when they tried to present a UN report that alleged that hundreds of people have died because of his rule. I mean, it doesn't sound like a man who is really facing up to reality in the situation.
Well, obviously, there are certain problems in Venezuela, without a doubt. It's very refreshing every time I hear Nicolas Maduro admit in an international press conference that, yes, there are problems here in Venezuela, there are economic problems. However, he does then continue to stress that it is up to the Venezuelans to sort out these problems, not up to Washington or any sort of international alliance. It is very difficult for him to deal with the situation in the country at the moment, given the international context. But yes, he does need to address his internal domestic affairs if he wants to have any sort of success for Venezuela.
Vanessa, how good is he? How well is he coping on that front?
Oh, I think he's absolutely not coping with reality at all. Or perhaps he is, and this is the greatest bluff of all time. I mean, the reality is that pressure is building no matter what. Everybody has accepted, even Russia and China to some degree, that they'll never get their money back, that Venezuela will never recover its productive capacity or recover economically unless Maduro and his cronies are out of power. There's a number of reasons for this. One is certainly the sanctions, but also is the fact that they have stolen more than $500 billion. I mean, this is the greatest kleptocracy in history. Nobody has ever seen such grand-scale corruption. We don't need, I mean, if Maduro wanted to fix this crisis, he could just use his own bank accounts and that of his cronies, and that could feed the entire country. I mean, so, you know, it's they who have caused the problem. And if you're opposed to, you know, corrupt elites abusing the poor people, then you should really be, you know, really object to what has happened with the Maduro regime. And everybody, so the Russians and the Chinese don't even trust him to do that, to rebuild the country and for them to get repaid. Their plan, their economic plan is no economic plan. There is nothing in there that improves the fate of the country. So he's cornered, really, in one way or another. I mean, and Russia and China may well hold out to see what happens with the military. Yes, he's their guy, but they're also having back-channel negotiations here in Washington, D.C. with Guaidó's team. And I know for a fact that Russia, even in the summer of 2017, was considering negotiating with the opposition when the protests were hot, because they were concerned that it might flip then. So they are open to just, you know, to protecting their interests. And as this sinkhole gets bigger for Maduro, you know, the change is going to be inevitable one way or another. So he needs to sort of accept that.
And Colin, how loyal is the military to Maduro? I mean, perhaps Juan Guaidó has been slightly surprised by their steadfastness so far.
We've certainly been disappointed by it. I mean, I think the latest figure I've seen is something like 274 members of the Venezuelan security forces have crossed over into Colombia or to Brazil. Which is it's not an inconsiderable number, but I mean, what they need is officers leading their men over in entire units, and that hasn't happened. So yes, I think there is a certain disappointment there that their initial plan that the military would see which side their bread was buttered on and would come over to the constitution, as they put it. But the fact is that the military are bought into the present regime, and particularly into the massive corruption. Of course, they control food distribution. They control the head of the oil company is a National Guard general. They are very much part of the setup, and I think offers of amnesty, which Juan Guaidó has made, may be attractive to people in the lower ranks, and they're the ones who've gone over so far. But to the senior officers who are doing very well from the present setup, I don't think they really trust the opposition, and they're not at all sure what their future would be under a government controlled by the opposition. So I think their calculation, at least for the present, is that they're better staying where they are.
So what might it take to sway them? Because people often say that the military holds the key to this crisis and the way that it goes one way or the other.
Well, it's very hard to say. I mean, the massive demonstrations there have been, and we saw pictures at the weekend of people pleading with women police officers at the border to let the aid through, and apparently the police officers were in tears, but they didn't let them through. And it was a surprise, I think, to the opposition when the huge street demonstrations that took place in Caracas and other cities. It didn't sway the military. They stopped the massive repression in recent demonstrations, but they didn't show any sign of budging. And I think if the oil sanctions, which we've heard about, if they do start to make things visibly and palpably worse for the country as a whole, some more military officers, and there are plenty who've been expressing unease and discontent and so on, it might concentrate their minds even more, and they may feel that this has got to stop and some action has to be taken, but it hasn't happened yet. I think the opposition have to realise, and I think the countries supporting the opposition are accepting that this is in for the long haul. It's not going to be quick, whatever happens.
Paul, so the military is not swayed, and indeed it appears, as Colin was saying, to be digging in and in fact killed people over the weekend during these opposition attempts to bring in the aid. I mean, that does not look good, does it? Maduro's already lost a lot of support amongst Venezuelan people. I mean, that's only going to bleed him more.
Well, I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that, Laura. I think the actions taken by Juan Guaidó, who we have to remember is an unelected man trying to unconstitutionally assume presidential power. This is a coup d'etat. This has reborn a patriotic spirit in many sectors across Venezuela, including the armed forces, but many civilian sectors who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves government supporters, but are vehemently against any sort of foreign intervention or any foreign imposition on Venezuela. We have to look at this in the historical context of US intervention in Venezuela, but also in the region over the last 50 years. And anything that smells of US intervention, even 5 cargo planes coming from the US military landing 8 kilometers across the border, as we saw it other weekend, really rekindles this patriotic spirit across the country, and will probably politically actually end up pushing people into the Maduro camp.
Right.
He already has a significant support base, as we saw at the marches at the weekend.
I'm just going to cross over to Vanessa there, because I can see she's itching to get in. Do you agree with that?
Yes, yes, I am. No, actually, I really don't. I do agree that there's always sensitivity about, U.S. intervention or the U.S. role, and that's historical and that's Latin American. There's a great book written by a Venezuelan called The Latin Americans, Their Love-Hate Relationship with the United States, which takes a rather more nuanced view than what is being presented by my fellow panelists. I do want to differ, however. I am Venezuelan, by the way, and I have a lot of friends there still, and I have traveled to Venezuela. I was there during the protests in 2017, and I've kept in touch since. They had, even in 2017, the military had great concern about whether they were actually following the Constitution. The concept of constitutionality was very important. I have accepted, in fact, that Guaidó is the constitutional president. I know for a fact that Padrino López had conversations with other counterparts in the region where he considered the fact that he understood privately that Guaidó is a constitutional president, but that he cannot flip, that he doesn't believe the amnesty, that he can't bring enough men to support him, and therefore was going to stay put. The question of Guaidó's presidency being constitutional has been settled. It is, in fact, and in fact, Maduro should never even have run for the presidency in 2013, when Chavez did not present himself for the presidency because he was dead in Cuba. It should have been Diosdado Cabello, who was then the president of the National Assembly. The only reason why Maduro ran is because he was anointed by Chavez, but that was against the constitution that Chavez wrote. So Maduro is a two-time usurper. And the filling of the void of the president of the National Assembly by Guaidó is foreseen in that constitution.
Okay.
Even the senior military in private conversations accept that. So that needs to be settled. That's off the table. I do agree that they have a very hard time flipping because they are so in bed with massive criminal activity, including drug trafficking, terrorist financing, grand-scale corruption, that they probably have some doubts as to, A, what their fate would be, and whether amnesty is actually credible.
Okay.
Because as we've seen in Argentina and Chile and other places, you'll get an activist judge who won't accept the amnesty.
Colin, whether or not you believe that Guaidó is the rightful president at this point in time, the fact is he's not in the country at the moment. He's in Colombia, and he violated a travel ban to go there. Do you think he's going to be allowed back into Venezuela?
Well, we'll have to see. I mean, he seems confident that he will be. When asked in Colombia what he was going to do, he said, well, I'm going to fly back to Maiquetía, to the airport, as a president would, and, resume my activities. Whether he will then be arrested, of course, we'll have to wait and see. I think he's banking on the Maduro government not daring to do such a blatantly provocative thing, but we don't know. And if he does do this return this week, we'll have to see
Paul,
what happens.
Just in the 30 seconds that we have left, should Maduro let him back in and not arrest him, let him run this course?
Well, he's quite clearly broken a law in Venezuela, Juan Guaidó. He's broken numerous laws. So under the legal system, he should be arrested. And there are many people across the country clamoring for his arrest. But maybe it's not the wisest political move by Maduro. And it'd be clever just to let him burn himself out. He's already losing massive amounts of support and momentum. He's lost many allies over the weekend. He's losing his support base.
Okay.
So maybe clever for Maduro just to leave him be and he'll burn himself out.
Well, that remains to be seen. He's still got the backing of around 50 countries, so perhaps not everyone will agree with that final thought there from you, Paul. But many thanks to all of you for joining us here today. Paul Dobson, Vanessa Neumann and Colin Harding. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.